the first time I saw the Alpha King. He was standing alone in the palace gardens at midnight, and I thought he was the loneliest person I had ever encountered. I shouldn't have been there, of course. Palace servants, especially Omega-1s assigned to the outer halls, weren't meant to wander the royal grounds after sunset. But sleep had been elusive that night, my small chamber in the servants' quarters feeling more like a cage than sanctuary, and the autumn air had called to me with promises of peace that nowhere else could provide. So I had slipped through corridors I wasn't supposed to know, past guards who didn't expect anyone as insignificant as me to be moving through shadows, and found myself in the gardens that served as the heart of a kingdom I barely understood. The Alpha King stood with his back to me, shoulders bearing the weight of decades of command, his dark hair silver-touched in moonlight that turned him into something between man and monument. Even from a distance, his presence filled the space around him, with the kind of quiet authority that made the very air seem to hold its breath. Everyone spoke of Kedrick Ironfang in whispers edged with awe and careful distance, the king who had unified warring territories through strength and strategy, the leader who had sacrificed everything, including, they said, his capacity for human connection, to forge a realm where shifters could live without fear. He was legend made flesh, walking among mortals, but belonging to something larger than ordinary life. But in that moment, watching him stand alone among flowers that bloomed without acknowledgement and fountains that sang to no audience, I saw something different. I saw a man who had forgotten what it felt like to exist without the weight of a crown, who moved through his own palace like a guest in someone else's life. I should have retreated, should have slipped back through shadows and returned to my proper place among the invisible servants who kept the palace functioning while remaining forever unseen. Instead, I found myself moving closer, drawn by curiosity stronger than common sense. "They're night-blooming jasmine," I said quietly, gesturing toward the flowers that had captured his attention. "They only open after dark. Most people never see them at their best." The Alpha King turned toward me with movements that carried decades of instinctive readiness for threat or challenge. His eyes, darker than midnight and just as vast, found mine with the kind of direct attention that made my Omega instincts scream warnings about dominant predators and the price of drawing their notice. But instead of the anger or dismissal I expected, his expression held something approaching surprise, as if he couldn't quite believe someone had materialized from shadows to offer conversation rather than submission. "You shouldn't be here," he said, though his tone carried observation rather than command. "Neither should you," I replied before I could think better of it. "I mean, not alone like this. Not when you clearly need—" I caught myself before finishing the sentence, horrified by my own presumption. "Need what?" His voice was quiet, curious rather than threatening. "Company," I admitted, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. "Or at least someone who sees you as more than a crown with legs attached." The silence that followed lasted long enough for me to catalog every way I had just violated protocol, insulted royal dignity, and probably earned myself immediate exile from the only employment I'd managed to secure since arriving in the capital with nothing but hope and stubborn determination. Instead, something that might have been amusement flickered in the Alpha King's expression. "And you think you see me as more than that? I think," I said carefully, "that you're standing in a garden at midnight because palaces are full of people who want things from kings, but empty of people who simply want to know how kings are feeling." His sharp intake of breath suggested my observation had landed closer to truth than either of us was comfortable with. We stood there in the charged silence that follows unexpected honesty, two people who shouldn't be sharing the same space, discovering that some conversations transcend the boundaries that normally keep worlds separate. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Elena." I hesitated, then added, "Elena Moss. I work in the outer halls, cleaning mostly. Maintenance tasks. Nothing important." "Everything that keeps the palace functioning is important," he said with conviction that surprised me. "I'm Kedrick. I know who you are, Your Majesty. In this garden, at this hour, just Kedrick." His smile was barely visible in moonlight, but it transformed his stern features into something approaching approachable. "Tell me, Elena Moss of the outer halls, how long have you been watching palace life from the margins?" 6 months. The admission came easier than expected. Long enough to see how people react when you walk through rooms. Like they're terrified they'll say or do something that disappoints you. And how do they think they might disappoint me? By being human, I said simply. By having needs or opinions or moments of weakness that remind everyone that even kings are just people trying to figure out how to get through each day. The truth of my words seemed to settle over him like revelation, as if no one had ever articulated something he'd felt, but never been able to name. When he looked at me again, his expression held depths of recognition that made my pulse quicken with possibilities I wasn't prepared to examine. You speak as if you know something about feeling disappointed by human nature. I know something about being invisible, I replied honestly, about existing in spaces between other people's awareness. It gives you perspective on things that those at the center never see. What kind of perspective? I considered the question, studying his face for signs that he was genuinely curious, rather than simply making polite conversation with a servant who had overstepped her bounds. I see how exhausting it must be to never relax your guard, to know that every expression, every gesture, every moment of inattention gets interpreted as policy, or weakness, or divine judgment. I paused, gathering courage for words I'd never expected to speak aloud. I see how lonely it must be to live surrounded by people who love your position but barely know your personality. And what do you think you know about my personality? The challenge in his voice might have intimidated someone who had more to lose, but I'd spent months watching him move through palace corridors with careful isolation, had seen the way his shoulders tensed when courtiers approached with requests, had noticed how he lingered in empty rooms as if gathering strength for the next performance of royal authority. I think you're tired, I said quietly. Tired of being symbol instead of person. Tired of having every human connection filtered through politics and protocol. I think you miss being seen as more than the sum of your responsibilities. You think I miss being seen? I think, I said with growing certainty, that you've been invisible for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to exist in someone else's awareness, simply because they enjoy your presence. The words hung between us like bridge neither of us had expected to need. Around us, the garden breathed with night sounds, wind through leaves, water moving over stone, the distant call of hunting owls conducting their ancient business. But in our small circle of moonlight, an unexpected honesty, the only sound was the careful rhythm of breathing, as two people who had lived on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide discovered they might have more in common than either had dared hope. Elena, he said finally, my name carrying weight I couldn't interpret. Do you know what people say about me? Which people? About what? The court, the pack, everyone who thinks they understand what kinds of connections are appropriate for someone my age, my position. His expression grew distant, as if he was seeing conversations I couldn't hear. They say I'm too old for love, too set in my ways, too damaged by loss to risk opening my heart again. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I understood where his confession was leading. They say you should be grateful for the respect and authority you've earned, rather than hoping for anything as frivolous as genuine affection. Something like that. And what do you say? His smile was sharp as winter wind, carrying bitterness that spoke of years of accepting other people's limitations as truth about himself. I say, they're probably right. Love is for the young, for those who have time to make mistakes, and hearts still soft enough to heal from them. That's the biggest load of nonsense I've ever heard. The words escaped before I could stop them, carrying indignation that made my voice rise above the careful whispers appropriate for midnight conversations with royalty. Cadrick's eyebrows shot up in surprise, as if no one had ever contradicted his assessment of his own emotional capabilities. Excuse me? Love isn't about age or experience or having unmarked hearts, I said firmly, my anger at his court's cruelty overriding my sense of self-preservation. Love is about recognition, about finding someone who sees you clearly and chooses to stay anyway, about building something together that's stronger than either of you could create alone. You speak as if you have experience with such things. I speak as if I have eyes and basic emotional intelligence, I retorted. Neither of which seems particularly common around here if people are telling you that caring for someone is privilege reserved for the young and foolish. Elena, no, let me finish. I stepped closer, my omega instincts screaming warnings about challenging alpha authority even as my sense of justice demanded I speak truth he needed to hear. You know what I see when I look at you? I see someone who's spent so long taking care of everyone else that he's forgotten he deserves care too. I see someone who's been told that strength means isolation, that leadership means loneliness. And what do you think strength actually means? I think strength means being vulnerable with people who've earned that trust. I think leadership means creating space for others to flourish, not carrying everything alone. I paused, meeting his eyes directly, despite the way the contact made my heart race. And I think whoever told you that love is wasted on people with experience doesn't understand the first thing about what love actually is. The silence that followed was charged with something I couldn't name. Recognition, possibility, the kind of electric awareness that precedes lightning strikes. Kedrick stared at me as if I was a puzzle he couldn't solve, as if my words had challenged assumptions he'd carried for so long they'd become indistinguishable from truth. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "What did you expect?" "Fear, deference, the kind of careful distance that everyone else maintains when they're in my presence." His voice dropped to something approaching wonder. Not someone who would lecture the Alpha King about his emotional limitations. "Maybe," I said with a smile I couldn't suppress, "you've been talking to the wrong people." "Maybe I have." We stood there in charged silence, two people from completely different worlds discovering that connection could bridge gaps that protocol insisted were unbridgeable. Around us, the palace slept on, unaware that in its gardens something was beginning that would challenge every assumption about appropriate relationships and the nature of love itself. "Elena," Kedrick said quietly, "would you walk with me? I find I'm not quite ready for this conversation to end. The invitation should have terrified me, should have sent me fleeing back to my proper place among the palace's invisible servants, back to the safety of existing without notice or complication. Instead, I found myself nodding agreement, taking the arm he offered with gallant formality that belonged to someone who remembered how to be gentleman as well as king. "Where shall we walk?" "Wherever you'd like," he replied. For the first time in longer than I can remember, I'm not needed anywhere else. Tonight, I'm just Kedrick, walking through gardens with someone whose company I find unexpectedly refreshing. As we began moving along paths designed for royal contemplation, but rarely graced by royal presence, I reflected on the impossibility of my situation. 6 hours ago, I had been Elena Moss, invisible Omega servant, notable only for my ability to clean efficiently without drawing attention. Now I was walking arm in arm with the Alpha King himself, engaged in conversation that felt more natural than anything I'd experienced since arriving in the capital. The transformation was dizzying in its speed and implications. "Are you having second thoughts?" Kedrick asked, apparently reading something in my expression. "I'm having realistic thoughts," I corrected, "about how completely inappropriate this is, and what will happen when someone notices that you're spending time with palace servant instead of conducting important royal business." "Let me worry about managing court expectations," he said, with dry humor. "You focus on deciding whether you enjoy my company enough to risk occasional complications. Do you enjoy my company?" "More than I've enjoyed anyone's in years," he admitted with honesty that made my chest tighten with emotions I wasn't prepared to examine. "You see me, Elena. Not the crown, not the legend, not the political symbol, just the person underneath all those layers of necessity. Is that important to you? Being seen?" "I didn't think it was," he said quietly. "I thought I'd made peace with being valued for what I could provide rather than who I was. But talking with you tonight, it reminds me of things I didn't realize I'd lost." "What kind of things?" "The pleasure of conversation without agenda. The relief of being myself, without constantly calculating how that self will be interpreted by others." He paused beside fountain that sparkled with captured moonlight. "The simple joy of spending time with someone whose presence makes me feel more human rather than less." His words carried weight that suggested this midnight encounter meant more to him than casual interaction with curious servant. The realization that the Alpha King, powerful, legendary, seemingly self-sufficient in all things, might actually need the kind of uncomplicated acceptance I offered was both thrilling and terrifying. "Kedrick," I said carefully, "what happens tomorrow? When the sun rises and you're king again, and I'm back to being an invisible servant who shouldn't even know your gardens exist?" "Tomorrow," he said with a smile that held promises I wasn't sure either of us understood, "I think we'll discover whether tonight was anomaly or beginning of something neither of us saw coming." As we continued walking through gardens designed for solitary contemplation, but suddenly feeling like sacred space shared between two people discovering unexpected connection, I found myself hoping that tomorrow would bring courage to match tonight's revelation. The Alpha King was not too old for love, but whether love was brave enough for the complexities of his world remained to be seen. The knock on my chamber door came 3 mornings later, soft but insistent enough to wake me from dreams filled with moonlight conversations and amber eyes that seemed to see straight through to my soul. I opened it, expecting to find another servant with work assignments or perhaps news of some palace crisis requiring additional cleaning staff. Instead, I found a woman whose elegant bearing and expensive clothes marked her as someone far above my station, and whose expression suggested she had not come calling for pleasant social reasons. Miss Elena Moss? Her voice carried the kind of cultured precision that belonged to those born to authority. Yes, ma'am. Though I'm not sure why, I'm Lady Catherine Ironfang, the Alpha King's sister. She stepped into my tiny chamber without invitation, her assessing gaze taking in the sparse furnishings and careful organization that marked someone who owned very little, but maintained it well. I think we need to have conversation. My stomach dropped as implications of her visit became clear. Someone had noticed my midnight encounter with Cadric. Someone had decided that connection needed to be addressed before it could develop into anything resembling ongoing relationship. Of course, my lady. Please, sit wherever you'd like. I gestured toward my single chair, while settling myself on the edge of my narrow bed. Though I should mention that I haven't done anything wrong, if that's what this is about. Haven't you? Lady Catherine's smile was polite as poisoned honey. My dear girl, you've spent time alone with the Alpha King. You've engaged him in personal conversation. You've somehow convinced him to see you as more than palace furniture. Her expression grew serious. That may not be wrong in any legal sense, but it's certainly unprecedented. And dangerous. Dangerous to whom? To everyone involved, but particularly to you. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to something approaching genuine concern. Elena. May I call you Elena? Do you have any idea what you're playing with here? I'm not playing with anything, I replied firmly. I had conversation with someone who seemed like he needed company. That's all. That's all? Lady Catherine laughed, but the sound held no humor. My dear child, that someone is the most powerful alpha in the continental territories. He hasn't shown personal interest in anyone since his mate died 15 years ago. The fact that he's noticed you at all is going to send shockwaves through political circles you can't even imagine. I didn't ask him to notice me. No, but you did ask him to see you as human rather than king. Her eyes narrowed with something approaching respect, which, I'll admit, took either tremendous courage or tremendous stupidity. I'm still trying to decide which. I studied Lady Catherine's face, looking for clues about her intentions. She didn't seem hostile exactly, but neither did she seem like ally prepared to support whatever connection was developing between her brother and me. What do you want me to do? I asked finally. I want you to understand what you're stepping into before you take any more steps. She settled back in her chair with air of someone prepared for lengthy explanation. Cadric has spent decades building reputation as leader who puts duty above personal desire. That reputation is foundation of his political authority and the stability of our entire realm. And you think spending time with me undermines that reputation? I think spending time with palace servant, particularly young, pretty palace servant, opens him up to accusations of impropriety, poor judgment, and the kind of scandal that enemies can exploit. Her tone grew sharper. There are those who would love nothing more than to see the Alpha King distracted by inappropriate romantic entanglement. We had one conversation, I protested, in garden, about flowers and loneliness. How does that constitute inappropriate romantic entanglement? Because it's never just one conversation with men like my brother. Lady Catherine's expression grew almost pitying. He's been isolated for so long that any genuine human connection feels revolutionary. If you show him kindness, acceptance, the basic courtesy of treating him as person rather than symbol, he'll interpret that as something far more significant than you intended. Her words hit uncomfortably close to concerns I'd been trying to ignore since our midnight encounter. The way Cadric had looked at me, the careful way he'd spoken my name, the invitation to walk with him through gardens, all of it suggested that our brief connection had affected him more than casual interaction would warrant. What if it is significant? I asked quietly. What if what happened between us matters to both of us? Then you're both in for a great deal of pain. Lady Catherine's voice carried genuine sadness. Elena, I can see that you're a good person. Honest, kind, probably exactly what Cadric needs in personal sense. But personal needs don't determine royal policy. Political reality does. What political reality? The reality that Alpha Kings don't mate servants. The reality that our bloodline maintains its authority through careful alliance building and strategic partnerships. The reality that whatever you and Cadric might feel for each other, It cannot be allowed to develop into anything that threatens the stability he spent his entire life building. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest as understanding of her message became clear. You're telling me to stay away from him. I'm telling you to protect both of yourselves by ending this before it becomes something that could destroy you both. Her expression held sympathy that made her warning even more devastating. He cares for you already, Elena. More than is wise, more than is safe. If you care for him in return, you'll spare him the choice between duty and desire. And if I don't, if I decide that what's developing between us is worth pursuing despite political complications, Lady Catherine's smile was sad as winter sunset. Then you'll discover exactly how ruthless court politics can be when threatened by inconvenient romance. You'll watch as people you've never met tear apart your character, your motives, and your right to exist in the same space as their king. And eventually, you'll watch Cedric choose duty over love, because that's who he is and who he's always been. The silence that followed was heavy with implications I wasn't prepared to handle. Everything Lady Catherine said made logical sense. Royal relationships operated according to rules I didn't understand and couldn't navigate. Political considerations that would always supersede personal feelings. But logic couldn't erase the memory of standing in moonlit garden with someone who'd looked at me like I was revelation rather than servant. Logic couldn't diminish the recognition I'd seen in Cedric's eyes, or the way his presence had made me feel more substantial than I'd ever felt in my life. What if you're wrong? I asked finally. What if he's strong enough to choose love when it matters? Then he'll cease being the king this realm needs, Lady Catherine replied simply, and you'll have to live with knowing that your love destroyed everything he worked to build. With that devastating assessment, she rose from her chair and moved toward my door, with same elegant authority she'd carried into my room. But before leaving, she paused to deliver one final piece of advice. Think carefully about what you truly want, Elena, and ask yourself whether your feelings for Cedric are strong enough to survive watching them tear him apart. After she was gone, I sat alone in my chamber and tried to process conversation that had turned my small world upside down. 3 days ago, I had been invisible servant, content with my anonymity and the simple pleasure of honest work. Now I was apparently central figure in potential scandal that could reshape kingdom. The smart thing would be to heed Lady Catherine's warning, to avoid any further contact with Cedric, to return to my proper place among Palace's unseen servants, to let whatever connection we'd discovered fade into memory of one perfect midnight conversation. The brave thing would be to trust that what we'd found together was worth fighting for, regardless of political complications or social expectations. But as I stared out my tiny window at gardens where everything had changed, I realized I had no idea which choice would require more courage, protecting Cedric from scandal by walking away, or protecting what we'd begun by refusing to let others define its limitations. The only thing I knew for certain was that tomorrow would bring decision I wasn't sure I was wise enough to make. But perhaps, I thought, as afternoon light painted patterns across my floor, wisdom was less important than honesty about what my heart had already chosen. 2 weeks passed without sight of the Alpha King, and I discovered that missing someone I barely knew could feel like missing piece of my own soul. I threw myself into work with desperate efficiency, scrubbing floors until they gleamed, polishing surfaces that had never needed such attention, organizing storage rooms that had been neglected for years. Physical labor had always been my refuge from emotional turmoil, but this time even the most demanding tasks couldn't quiet the restless ache that had settled permanently in my chest. The other servants noticed my increased intensity, though none dared comment directly. Palace staff had perfected the art of observing without acknowledging, of seeing everything while speaking of nothing that might invite unwanted attention from those above their station. Elena's been different, I heard whispered in the laundry rooms. Distracted, like she's waiting for something that isn't coming. They weren't wrong. I was waiting. For another midnight encounter, for chance meeting in corridor, for any sign that our garden conversation had meant more to Cedric than momentary curiosity about invisible servant who dared speak to him without reverence. Instead, I learned through kitchen gossip that the Alpha King had departed the palace entirely, summoned to territorial disputes on the northern borders that required his personal attention. The official word was that negotiations were proceeding well but slowly, requiring extended royal presence to ensure satisfactory resolution. The unofficial word, whispered among servants who knew more about palace dynamics than they were supposed to, was that certain members of the royal council had strongly encouraged this particular diplomatic mission. Apparently, Rumors of the king's unusual garden stroll had reached ears that preferred their sovereign focused entirely on matters of state. "They're keeping him busy," observed Martha, the head of housekeeping staff, as we sorted linens in the warm security of the laundry room, making sure he doesn't have time for distractions. Her meaningful glance in my direction made it clear that I was the distraction in question. "I don't know what you mean," I replied carefully, though my burning cheeks probably betrayed me. "Course you don't, dear." Martha's smile was knowing but not unkind. "Just like you don't know why Lady Catherine came calling on you last week, or why you've been working yourself half to death ever since." The kindness in her voice was my undoing. Before I could stop myself, words were pouring out. About the midnight garden, about Cedric's loneliness, about Lady Catherine's warning and my own confusion about what any of it meant. Martha listened without judgment, her weathered face reflecting decades of palace service that had taught her when to speak and when to simply witness. When I finished, she was quiet for long moments, her hands continuing their steady work, while her mind processed what I'd shared. "That explains few things," she said finally. "The extra guards in garden areas, the sudden interest certain council members have shown in your work assignments, the way conversation stops when you enter rooms." "People are talking about me?" "People are trying very hard not to talk about you," Martha corrected, "which means everyone's thinking about you, which is much more dangerous for someone in your position." "What should I do?" "Depends what you want, child." Martha's eyes were gentle but direct. "You want simple life? Keep your head down and wait for gossip to find newer target. You want something else?" She shrugged expressively. "Well, then you'd better decide how much you're willing to risk for it. What would you do if you were in my situation?" Martha smiled, her expression carrying memories I couldn't interpret. I'd ask myself whether I'd rather spend my life wondering what if, or knowing I'd been brave enough to find out. Her words followed me through the rest of that day and into evening, when I found myself once again drawn to palace gardens, despite every logical reason to avoid them. I told myself I was simply enjoying autumn air, taking advantage of rare free time to walk paths that belonged to everyone in the palace. But truthfully, I was hoping. The gardens were different in Cedric's absence, beautiful still, but somehow hollow. Without his presence to give them meaning, they felt like stage sets waiting for performance that might never come. I wandered through carefully maintained paths, remembering every word of our conversation, every moment when his guarded expression had softened into something approaching genuine connection. "You're playing dangerous game, little Omega." The voice that interrupted my reverie was male, cultured, and carried undertones that made my skin crawl with instinctive warnings. I turned to find man I didn't recognize watching me from shadows between ornamental trees. Tall, well-dressed, with pale eyes that assessed me like predator evaluating prey. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" I asked, though every instinct screamed at me to retreat to better-lit areas where palace guards might notice if situation became threatening. "Lord Marcus Blackthorne," he replied with smile that never reached his eyes. "Member of the Royal Council, advisor to His Majesty on matters of territorial security." The way he emphasized those last words suggested they encompassed more than simple border disputes. This was someone who concerned himself with threats to royal stability, which apparently now included curious servants who drew unwanted royal attention. "I see. Well, Lord Blackthorne, if you'll excuse me, I should return to my duties. Actually, I was hoping we might have brief conversation." He stepped into my path with casual authority that made clear this wasn't request. "About your recent interactions with certain members of the royal family. I haven't had any interactions worth discussing. Haven't you?" His pale eyes glittered with something approaching amusement. "Strange. Palace security reported seeing you in deep conversation with the Alpha King just days before his sudden departure for northern territories. Curious timing, wouldn't you agree?" The threat implicit in his words was clear. He knew about my midnight encounter with Cedric, knew that timing of the king's diplomatic mission was connected to that conversation, and wanted me to understand that powerful people were monitoring my activities with unfriendly interest. "The Alpha King spoke to me briefly about garden flowers," I said with as much dignity as I could manage. "Hardly matter of territorial security." "Everything involving the king is matter of territorial security," Lord Blackthorne corrected softly. "His attention, his time, his emotional state, all of these affect his ability to govern effectively. When servants begin consuming resources that should be devoted to royal duties, It becomes my concern. I'm not consuming any resources. Aren't you? He circled me slowly, his movement reminiscent of wolf evaluating wounded prey. The king's thoughts, his focus, his consideration of matters that have nothing to do with governance. These are precious resources that cannot be wasted on inappropriate attachments. There's nothing inappropriate about treating someone with basic human decency. There's everything inappropriate about servant presuming to offer counsel to her sovereign, he replied sharply. About Omega imagining herself suitable companion for Alpha King. About foolish girl mistaking royal politeness for genuine interest. Each word was calculated to wound, to remind me of my place, and the presumption of imagining I could transcend it. But instead of shame, his attack sparked anger that burned away the confusion and self-doubt that had plagued me since Lady Catherine's visit. "You're afraid," I said suddenly, the realization crystallizing as I spoke it. "You're terrified that he might actually choose happiness over duty, that he might discover there's more to life than political maneuvering and strategic alliances." Lord Blackthorn's expression went very cold. "I'm practical about maintaining stability that keeps this realm from descending into chaos. You're threatened by possibility that the Alpha King might remember he's person as well as ruler." I stepped closer, my own anger overriding caution. "You've built your entire position on keeping him isolated, on making sure he needs advisors like you to interpret the world for him. But if he starts forming genuine connections, if he begins trusting his own judgment about who deserves his time and attention, you have no idea what you're talking about." "I have perfect idea." My voice rose despite every instinct warning me to show appropriate deference to his rank. "You're part of the system that's convinced him love is luxury he can't afford, that caring for someone is weakness rather than strength. Well, maybe it's time someone told him differently." The silence that followed was charged with possibility for violence. Lord Blackthorn stared at me with expression that suggested he was reassessing previous assumptions about my intelligence and potential threat level. "Miss Moss," he said finally, his voice carrying new edge of respect alongside continued menace. "You're more perceptive than I expected, which makes you considerably more dangerous than I initially believed." "Dangerous to whom?" "To established order, to careful balance of power that keeps this kingdom stable." His smile was sharp as Winterblade. "To advisors who've spent years ensuring that royal decisions serve broader interests rather than personal desires." "Maybe royal decisions should serve personal desires sometimes," I replied firmly. "Maybe the Alpha King deserves to make choices based on what makes him happy, rather than what satisfies political calculations. And maybe naive servants should leave complex governmental matters to those qualified to understand them. I understand plenty. I understand that you're all so invested in controlling him that you've forgotten he's human being with right to form connections, to seek companionship, to choose happiness when opportunity presents itself." Lord Blackthorn stepped closer, his presence now openly threatening rather than merely assessing. "Miss Moss, let me be perfectly clear about something. The Alpha King's personal happiness is luxury this realm cannot afford. His duty is to serve his people, not to indulge romantic fantasies with unsuitable partners. And who decides what partners are suitable? Those of us with wisdom to understand that royal bloodlines require strategic preservation, that political alliances matter more than personal preferences, that keeping kingdom stable is more important than satisfying individual longings." His words echoed Lady Catherine's warnings, but with cruel precision that revealed the real machinery behind royal isolation. It wasn't just tradition or protocol keeping Cadric alone, it was deliberate policy enforced by people who benefited from his emotional distance. "You're all terrified," I said with sudden clarity. "Terrified that if he finds genuine happiness, he won't need your manipulation anymore, that he'll start making decisions based on his own judgment rather than your advice. We're realistic about requirements of leadership. You're invested in maintaining system that keeps you powerful." I felt pieces clicking together, patterns becoming clear. "How many potential relationships have you sabotaged over the years? How many people have you driven away from him?" Lord Blackthorn's expression confirmed my suspicions before he could formulate response. The Alpha King's legendary isolation wasn't natural consequence of his position. It was carefully orchestrated campaign designed to ensure he remained dependent on advisors who profited from his loneliness. "Miss Moss, you're beginning to understand situation that's far more complex than simple romance." His voice carried warning that suggested our conversation was approaching dangerous territory. "Perhaps you should consider whether your feelings for the king are worth the consequences of pursuing them." "What consequences?" the kind that befall servants who forget their place and imagine themselves capable of influencing royal policy. His smile was cold as Arctic wind. Accidents happen, you know. People disappear, particularly people who pose threats to stability. Oh, the implicit threat sent ice through my veins, but also crystallized my understanding of what was at stake. This wasn't just about my relationship with Kadric. It was about his right to choose his own connections, to form bonds based on genuine compatibility rather than political convenience. Are you threatening me, Lord Blackthorn? I'm explaining reality to someone who seems dangerously naive about how power operates. He straightened his expensive clothes with casual precision. The Alpha King belongs to this realm, Miss Moss. His time, his attention, his heart. All of these serve purposes larger than individual happiness. Keep that in mind as you consider your future actions. With that final warning, he melted back into garden shadows, leaving me alone with racing pulse and crystal-clear understanding of what I was truly facing. This wasn't just disapproval from class-conscious relatives or concern about appropriate royal behavior. This was war for Kadric's soul, fought by people who saw his happiness as threat to their power. And I had just declared myself combatant on the side they were determined to defeat. As I made my way back through palace corridors to my chamber, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that midnight conversation. 2 weeks ago, I had been invisible servant, notable only for efficiency and discretion. Now I was apparently enemy of the state, threat to political stability, dangerous influence on sovereign they were determined to keep isolated and controllable. The smart thing would be to heed Lord Blackthorn's warning, to retreat back into invisibility, and let the machinery of royal isolation continue its work unimpeded. But as I remembered the loneliness in Kadric's eyes, the careful way he'd spoken about being seen rather than simply obeyed, I knew I'd already chosen my course. If they wanted war for his happiness, they would have it. The only question now was whether I was strong enough to fight battles I barely understood against enemies who held every advantage except one. They didn't know what it felt like to care for someone more than they cared for power. Perhaps that would be enough. The Alpha King returned on the first day of winter, and the entire palace transformed overnight from cautious calm to electric anticipation. I learned of his arrival not through official announcement, but through kitchen gossip that traveled faster than royal messengers. Cook's assistant had seen the advance guard arriving before dawn. The stable master reported fresh horses being prepared for immediate departure to other territories. Lady Catherine had been observed in urgent consultation with council members, whose expressions suggested they were not pleased with whatever developments had brought their sovereign home ahead of schedule. And Martha, dear observant Martha, mentioned casually, as she assigned morning duties, that certain members of the housekeeping staff might want to ensure the royal chambers were prepared for immediate occupancy. Just routine maintenance, you understand, she said with studied innocence, making sure everything is in perfect order for when His Majesty chooses to resume residence. But her meaningful glance in my direction suggested she knew exactly which staff member would volunteer for that particular assignment. I found myself standing outside the Alpha King's private chambers with cleaning supplies I didn't need, and heart that hammered against my ribs like caged bird desperate for flight. The guards posted at his doors recognized me as palace staff, nodding acknowledgement as I explained my purpose with voice that barely shook. Inside, the royal chambers were exactly as imposing as I'd expected. Rich furnishings, priceless art, space designed to impress visiting dignitaries and remind everyone of occupants' supreme authority. But they were also surprisingly personal, filled with books that showed signs of being actually read, papers covered with notes in handwriting that suggested their owner thought through problems on page, small touches that revealed the man behind the crown. I was dusting completely clean surface when I heard footsteps in corridor outside, heavy, confident stride that belonged to someone accustomed to having path cleared before him. My pulse spiked with recognition and anticipation, but before I could decide whether to flee or stay, the door opened and Kadric entered his chambers. He looked exactly as I remembered and completely different. The same commanding presence, the same intelligent amber eyes that seemed to see everything at once. But there was something new in his expression, weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion, frustration that spoke of battles fought on multiple fronts, and underlying tension that suggested his time away had been anything but restorative. "Elena," he said, my name carrying surprise and something deeper that made my chest tighten with emotions I'd been trying to suppress. "I didn't expect to find you here. I volunteered for chamber preparation duty, I admitted, setting down my cleaning cloth with hands that trembled slightly. Martha thought you might want everything in perfect order upon your return. And what did you think? The question hung between us like bridge I wasn't sure I was brave enough to cross. He was giving me opportunity to explain my presence as simple duty fulfillment, to maintain safe distance that would protect us both from complications of deeper connection. Instead, I chose honesty. I thought I might not get another chance to see you, I said quietly, and I didn't want to spend my life wondering what might have happened if I'd been braver. The transformation in his expression was immediate and devastating. Surprise melting into relief. Relief deepening into something that might have been joy. He crossed the space between us in 3 quick strides, stopping close enough that I could see gold flecks in his amber eyes, could smell scent of winter air, and something indefinably wild that marked him as alpha. Elena, he said again. But this time my name carried weight I couldn't misinterpret. I thought about you every day I was away. Every meeting, every negotiation, every moment when I should have been focused entirely on territorial disputes. Part of my mind was back in that garden, reliving conversation that changed everything. Changed everything how? By reminding me that I'm more than just king, more than just symbol of royal authority. His hand rose to cup my cheek with gentleness that made my breath catch. By showing me what it feels like to be seen as person rather than position. Cedric, they kept me away deliberately, he continued, his voice carrying anger that had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with forces that had conspired to separate us. Manufactured crisis that required personal royal attention. Negotiations that could have been handled by anyone with diplomatic training. All designed to give me time to reconsider inappropriate attachments. Lady Catherine came to see me, I admitted. She warned me about political complications, about damage our connection might cause to your authority. And what did you tell her? I told her I'd think about it. I met his eyes directly, letting him see decision I'd reached during weeks of missing him. And I did think about it, about whether you're too old for love, whether caring for someone like me is weakness you can't afford, whether I should protect you from scandal by disappearing back into invisibility. What conclusion did you reach? That anyone who thinks you're too old for love doesn't understand what love actually is. I stepped closer, my hand rising to cover his where it still cupped my cheek. That caring for someone isn't weakness, it's courage, and that protecting you from happiness would be cruelest thing I could possibly do. His sharp intake of breath suggested my words had found their mark. For a moment, we simply stood there, close enough to share breath, surrounded by luxury and authority that belonged entirely to his world, but somehow feeling like we were creating space that belonged to both of us. Elena, he said finally, voice rough with emotion he was no longer trying to hide. Are you certain? Once we cross this line, there's no pretending it's simple friendship or innocent conversation. The court will mobilize against you. My advisors will demand I end this connection, and you'll face pressure that could destroy someone with 10 times your experience. Are you trying to talk me out of caring for you? I'm trying to make sure you understand what you're choosing. I considered his warning, thinking about Lord Blackthorn's threats, Lady Catherine's concerns, the machinery of royal isolation that had kept him alone for so long. Then I thought about the loneliness I'd seen in his eyes that first night, the careful way he'd spoken about being visible to someone who valued his company rather than his authority. I understand that choosing you means choosing war with people who profit from your isolation, I said firmly. I understand that loving you will require courage I'm not sure I possess, and strength I'm still discovering. But I also understand that you deserve happiness, Cedric. You deserve to be loved for who you are, rather than what you can provide. And you think you can love me for who I am? I think, I said with a smile that felt like sunrise after longest night. I already do. The kiss that followed was everything I'd imagined, and nothing I'd been prepared for. Gentle but hungry, reverent but desperate, carrying promise of devotion that transcended politics and protocol. His arms came around me with careful strength, as if he was still learning to believe I was real, was truly choosing him, despite every logical reason to retreat. When we separated, both breathing hard, his forehead rested against mine, and his eyes held depths of gratitude that made my heart ache with fierce protectiveness. Elena, he whispered, my name like prayer of thanksgiving. My brave, impossible, wonderful Elena. Do you know what you've given me? What? Hope, he said simply. Hope that I can be more than just king, that I can choose happiness alongside duty, that someone remarkable enough to see past crown might actually choose to stay. I'm not going anywhere, I promised. Though I should probably warn you that your council members are going to hate this development. His laugh was rueful but determined. Let them hate it. For first time in decades, I'm making choice based on what I want rather than what others expect. And what I want, Elena Moss of the Outer Halls, is you. You have me, I replied with certainty that surprised us both. For as long as you want me, in whatever way honors both your happiness and your responsibilities. And if I want you as my mate, as my queen, as partner in ruling realm that's never seen Omega on throne, the question stole my breath with its implications. Queen, royal mate, position of authority that would place me at center of political machinery I barely understood, target for enemies I couldn't hope to fight alone. But as I looked into Kadrick's eyes and saw future painted there, shared decisions, mutual support, love that strengthened rather than weakened his ability to lead, I knew my answer. Then we'll teach them what real partnership looks like, I said with growing conviction, and prove that love doesn't make kings weaker. It makes them stronger. His second kiss was promise of battles we'd fight together, changes we'd create as team, life we'd build that honored both his crown and our hearts. Outside, winter wind rattled windows and political forces marshaled for conflicts yet to come. But inside the Alpha King's chambers, two people who'd found each other despite every obstacle began planning future that would challenge every assumption about power, duty, and love itself. The transformation was no longer approaching. It had already begun. The summons to appear before the full royal council came exactly 48 hours after Kadrick and I had declared our intentions to each other, and I knew with sinking certainty that someone had been watching, waiting, planning their response to what they saw as unprecedented crisis. You don't have to go alone, Kadrick said for the third time, as I prepared to face the political machinery that had spent decades controlling his personal life. I can demand to be present, refuse to let them interrogate you without royal protection, and prove their point that I'm distraction undermining your judgment. I smoothed my best dress, simple gray wool that was respectable without being pretentious, and tried to project confidence I didn't feel. No, if I'm going to be queen someday, I need to face their challenges on my own terms. Elena, you don't understand what you're walking into. These people have perfected the art of destroying threats to their authority. They'll use every weapon at their disposal: fear, shame, manipulation, outright intimidation. Then I'll have to be stronger than their weapons. I turned to face him, seeing my own determination reflected in his amber eyes. Kadrick, if we're going to build partnership that changes how this realm operates, it has to start with me proving I can handle political pressure without hiding behind your protection. His expression showed that he understood my logic, even as every protective instinct rebelled against letting me face his enemies alone. At least promise me you'll remember that their opinions don't define your worth. Whatever they say, whatever accusations they make, you are exactly what this kingdom needs. I'll remember. The council chamber was designed to intimidate. Soaring ceilings, massive table that put petitioners at disadvantage, chairs arranged so that speakers faced assembly of powerful figures without allies or support. I entered alone, as protocol demanded, and found myself facing 12 of the most influential people in the realm. Lady Catherine sat at the table's head, her expression carefully neutral in a way that suggested she felt conflicted about proceedings. Lord Blackthorn occupied position of honor at her right, his pale eyes glittering with anticipation of victory he'd been planning since our garden encounter. Around them sat other council members whose names I didn't know, but whose hostility was unmistakable. Miss Elena Moss, Lady Catherine began formally, you have been summoned to address concerns regarding your association with His Majesty the Alpha King. Do you understand the seriousness of this inquiry? I understand that you're concerned about the king's happiness, I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the way 12 pairs of judgmental eyes assessed my every word and gesture. Though I'm not entirely sure why that's cause for emergency council session. Murmurs of outrage rippled through the assembly at my apparent presumption. Lord Blackthorn leaned forward with a smile that promised unpleasant revelations. Miss Moss, perhaps you're unaware of the complexities involved in royal relationships. Allow me to enlighten you about what your association with the king actually represents. Please do. It represents breach of protocol so severe that it threatens the stability of our entire governmental structure. His voice carried authority designed to make listeners feel small and foolish. Royal mates are chosen through careful consideration of political alliance, bloodline compatibility, and strategic advantage to the realm. They are not selected based on momentary infatuation with unsuitable servants. And what makes me unsuitable? I asked, though I suspected the answer would be comprehensive and devastating. Where shall I begin? Lord Blackthorn consulted papers spread before him with theatrical precision. You have no noble bloodline, no political connections, no experience with diplomatic protocol. You bring no alliance value, no strategic advantage, no resources that could benefit the crown. I bring love, I said simply. Respect, partnership, the willingness to support him as person rather than simply as king. Admirable sentiments, acknowledged another council member whose expensive robes marked him as someone important. But sentiments don't negotiate trade agreements, maintain territorial boundaries, or ensure dynastic succession. No, I agreed, but they do ensure that your king remembers why those things matter, who he's fighting to protect, what he's working to preserve. Miss Moss, Lady Catherine interrupted before others could respond, with what looked like increasing hostility. While your affection for my brother is touching, you must understand that royal marriages serve purposes beyond personal satisfaction. They are instruments of statecraft, tools for maintaining peace and prosperity. And you think happiness makes him less effective as ruler? We think distraction makes him vulnerable to poor decisions, Lord Blackthorn said sharply. We think romantic attachment clouds judgment that must remain clear for sake of everyone he governs. Has it occurred to any of you that isolation might also cloud judgment? I felt anger beginning to burn through diplomatic caution. That spending decades alone, surrounded only by advisors who see him as political instrument rather than human being, might affect his ability to connect with people he's supposed to serve? The silence that followed was electric with tension. I had just accused the Royal Council of damaging their sovereign's effectiveness through enforced emotional isolation. Challenge so direct that several members looked genuinely shocked by my audacity. "Young woman," said elderly councillor whose authority seemed to command even Lord Blackthorn's deference, "you speak as if you understand requirements of kingship better than those who have devoted their lives to supporting royal authority. I speak as someone who sees what you've all forgotten, that kings are people first, rulers second, that denying human needs doesn't make someone stronger, it makes them brittle." I looked around the table, meeting each judgmental gaze with growing certainty. You've all invested so much in keeping him isolated that you've convinced yourselves isolation is strength rather than weakness. Isolation protects him from manipulation by those seeking personal advantage, Lady Catherine said quietly, though her tone suggested she was beginning to question her own arguments. Does it? Or does it make him more dependent on advisors who profit from controlling his access to other perspectives? I felt pieces clicking together, patterns becoming clear. How many potential relationships have you ended over the years? How many people who might have offered genuine companionship were driven away because they didn't serve your political purposes? The uncomfortable shifting around the table suggested my accusation had hit closer to truth than they wanted to admit. Lord Blackthorn's expression grew dangerous, as he realized I understood more about their methods than naive servants should. Miss Moss, you seem to have developed remarkably sophisticated understanding of court politics, for someone whose experience extends only to cleaning floors. His voice carried undertones that made my skin crawl. One might wonder where such insights originated. One might wonder why you're threatened by the possibility that the king could form relationship based on mutual respect, rather than political calculation. I'm threatened, he said with deadly softness, by naive girls who imagine themselves qualified to influence decisions affecting millions of people. And I'm offended by advisors who imagine themselves qualified to determine what emotional connections their sovereign is allowed to form. The confrontation was interrupted by sound of heavy doors opening with authority that made every council member instantly straighten in their chairs. Cadric entered the chamber with purposeful stride, his royal bearing making clear that this was not request for permission to join proceedings, but command that they include him. "Your Majesty," Lady Catherine rose hastily, "we were conducting preliminary inquiry as discussed. You were conducting interrogation of my chosen mate, without my knowledge or consent," Cadric corrected, his voice carrying chill that made several council members visibly recoil. "Which ends now. Brother, please understand that we're only trying to protect..." "You're trying to control," he interrupted, moving to stand beside my chair in gesture that clearly claimed partnership. "As you have for decades, as you did when you manufactured crisis that kept me away from court for 6 weeks, as you're doing now by attempting to intimidate someone whose only crime is caring for me." Lord Blackthorne recovered his composure first, though his pale eyes blazed with fury at having his schemes exposed. "Your Majesty, with greatest respect, your personal feelings cannot be allowed to override governmental stability, and governmental stability cannot be allowed to override basic human rights," Cadric replied firmly, "including my right to choose companions based on genuine compatibility rather than political convenience. Your Majesty, surely you understand that royal marriages are instruments of statecraft when they serve the realm's interests," Cadric finished, "but they are also personal unions that affect the happiness and effectiveness of the people involved. And I have determined that my happiness and effectiveness are best served by partnership with Elena." The formal declaration sent shocked murmurs through the assembly. By speaking of our relationship in terms of personal determination rather than political necessity, Cadric was asserting authority that transcended their advisory role, making clear that his choice of mate was sovereign decision rather than committee decision. "Your Majesty," the elderly counselor said carefully, "while we respect your authority in all matters, we must advise that public reception of such unusual union could create significant challenges for royal authority." "Public reception will be what we make it," Cadric replied, with confidence I wasn't sure was entirely warranted. "If we present this partnership as strengthening rather than weakening royal effectiveness, if we demonstrate that love enhances rather than diminishes my ability to serve, then public opinion will follow." "And if we're wrong?" Lady Catherine asked quietly. "If the noble houses reject Omega Queen, if the people decide that their king has lost his judgment to inappropriate infatuation, then we'll prove them wrong through actions rather than arguments," I said, rising to stand beside Cadric with decision that felt like stepping off cliff into unknown territory. "We'll show them that partnership built on mutual respect creates stronger leadership than isolation built on fear." "Bold words," Lord Blackthorne observed with skepticism that bordered on contempt. "But words don't address practical realities of governing realm that has never accepted Omega in position of royal authority." "Then perhaps it's time for this realm to evolve," Cadric said firmly. "Perhaps it's time to prove that strength comes from partnership rather than dominance, that leadership improves when it includes perspectives that have been traditionally excluded." "You're asking us to risk everything on untested theories about royal relationships," another council member protested. "To gamble political stability on romantic idealism. I'm asking you to trust my judgment about what makes me more effective as king," Cadric corrected. "And I'm telling you that Elena makes me better, more grounded, more connected to people I serve, more committed to building realm where everyone has opportunity to flourish." The silence that followed was heavy with implications none of us were entirely prepared to handle. The Royal Council was being asked to support unprecedented decision that challenged every tradition about appropriate royal relationships. I was being asked to accept role that would place me at center of political storms I barely understood. And Cadric was being asked to risk everything he'd built for sake of love that hadn't yet been tested by realities of shared rule. "Very well," Lady Catherine said finally, her voice carrying resignation mixed with something that might have been respect. "If this is truly your decision, brother, then we'll support it. But we do so with understanding that success will require extraordinary efforts from all involved." "What kind of efforts?" I asked. "Preparation," she replied. "Training in diplomatic protocol, education in governmental processes, careful introduction to noble houses who will need convincing that Omega Queen serves their interests rather than threatening them. And if they can't be convinced, then we'll face those challenges as they arise," Cadric said with determination that made my heart race with admiration and terror in equal measure. Together. As the council session concluded with grudging acceptance of what they couldn't prevent, I reflected on how completely my life had changed in span of single morning. Hours ago, I had been servant-facing hostile interrogation about presumptuous relationship with her sovereign. Now I was officially recognized as future queen, partner in ruling realm that had never seen Omega in position of royal authority, target for every enemy who profited from traditional power structures. The transformation was terrifying in its scope and implications. But as Cadric's hand found mine, As his amber eyes promised partnership in facing whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew I had chosen correctly. Love might not make ruling easier, but it would make it meaningful, and perhaps meaning was what this realm needed most. 3 months later, our engagement ceremony was held in the great hall before assembly that represented every major political faction in the kingdom. I stood beside Cadric in gown that had been crafted by royal seamstresses, but designed according to my preferences, elegant without being ostentatious, beautiful without being intimidating, appropriate for someone who would soon help lead, but had not forgotten her origins among those who served. The response from assembled nobility was mixed. Some faces reflected genuine curiosity about unprecedented royal partnership. Others showed barely concealed hostility toward Omega, who had presumed to claim position traditionally reserved for those with noble blood. Most displayed careful neutrality of people waiting to see which way political winds would blow before declaring their allegiances. But in front row, I could see faces that carried unmistakable approval. Servants who had watched our relationship develop with hope that someone who understood their lives might influence royal policy. Common-born citizens who had been granted unprecedented access to ceremony that celebrated love, transcending traditional barriers. Younger nobles who saw our partnership as model for relationships. Built on genuine compatibility, rather than political calculation. Do you, Cadric Ironfang, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, take this woman as your chosen mate, your partner in rule, your companion in all endeavors that honor both crown and heart? The high priest voice carried across assembly with authority that made even skeptical nobles pay attention. I do, Cadric replied, his voice strong enough to be heard throughout hall, his eyes never leaving mine as he spoke vows that would bind us together before gods and witnesses. I choose Elena not just as mate, but as equal partner in building realm where strength serves justice, where power serves people, where love serves as foundation for everything we hope to accomplish. And do you, Elena Moss, accept the responsibilities and honors of royal partnership, pledging to serve beside your king in pursuit of prosperity and peace for all who dwell within these territories? The moment of truth, the final chance to retreat back to safety of invisibility, to choose simple life over complex destiny that would demand everything I had, and more than I was sure I could provide. Instead, I thought about Midnight Garden, where Lonely King had discovered he could be seen as person rather than symbol. I thought about political machinery that had spent decades keeping him isolated and controllable. I thought about future we could build together, not perfect, not without struggles, but honest and hopeful in ways this realm had forgotten were possible. I do, I said clearly, my voice carrying across assembly with conviction that surprised even me. I choose partnership with Cadric not because I seek power or position, but because together we can prove that love strengthens, rather than weakens those who dare embrace it. The cheer that rose from common-born section of assembly was spontaneous and heartfelt, drowning out whatever objections might have come from more traditional quarters. As ancient rings were exchanged and blessing pronounced by priest whose own surprise was barely concealed, I realized we had just created something unprecedented in realm's history, not just royal marriage, but partnership that challenged every assumption about how power should operate and who deserved access to authority that shaped ordinary lives. When ceremony concluded, when last nobles had offered their congratulations with varying degrees of sincerity, Cadric and I found ourselves alone for first time since dawn preparation had begun. Any regrets? He asked with smile that suggested he already knew my answer. About which part? Agreeing to marry man I met in garden 3 months ago? Accepting role I'm completely unprepared for? Committing to partnership that will require us to rewrite every rule about how royal relationships operate? All of it. Everything that brought us to this moment. I looked around Great Hall where we had just pledged our lives to each other, and to service of realm that would test us in ways we couldn't yet imagine. Then I looked at Cadric, my partner, my king, my love whose courage had matched mine in choosing relationship that defied every reasonable expectation. Not one, I said finally. Though I reserve right to panic periodically about whether I'm qualified for job I've just accepted. We'll learn together, he promised, pulling me into embrace that felt like coming home and embarking on greatest adventure simultaneously. And we'll prove that love doesn't make leaders weaker, it makes them braver. Even when love is between people who shouldn't theoretically be compatible, especially then. His kiss tasted like promises kept and futures worth fighting for. Because sometimes the most important transformations begin with connections that nobody expects, but everybody needs. Outside, Kingdom waited to see what their unprecedented royal partnership would create. Inside Great Hall, two people who had found each other against all odds began building foundation for changes that would echo through generations. Love had not made the Alpha King too old or too set in his ways. It had made him exactly what his people needed, a leader brave enough to choose happiness alongside duty, wisdom alongside tradition, hope alongside the hard realities of governing those who depended on his strength. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.